He had nothing left. A former Navy SEAL stripped down to bare essentials. No home, no steady work, no one waiting at the end of any road. Just a beat-up pickup, a faded duffel bag, and a German shepherd who wouldn't leave his side. On a still river dock in North Carolina, he spent his last $10 on a rusted houseboat the whole town had written off. The hull leaked. The wood was soft with rot. People gave it a month at best, but nobody knew what lay beneath that broken floor, sealed away in a space untouched for decades. Something left behind by a man who'd walked a similar path. Something that would change the course of everything. If stories like this speak to you, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. We love knowing how far these stories reach. A still Boise morning stretched out beneath an open blue sky. Sunlight settled across small wooden houses, the air clean and calm, almost indifferent to the lives quietly unraveling inside them. Ryan Miller stood on the narrow porch of his rented place. One hand gripped the folded eviction notice. The other hung loose at his side, like it had forgotten its purpose. 34 years old, 6'1", built with the kind of dense, trained strength forged through years in the United States Navy SEALs. Broad shoulders, posture held straight from habit, not intention. His face carried the hard angles of a man who'd once made decisions without flinching. A strong jaw, faint stubble darkening his cheeks, a thin scar tracing a quiet line along his left brow. Dark brown hair, cropped close in regulation style, but his eyes told the rest of it. Blue-gray and distant, always drifting past the moment into something only he could reach. He'd been trained to cut through chaos without hesitation, trained to make split-second calls where lives hung in the balance. None of it prepared him for something this quiet, this final. 30 days. That's what the paper gave him. 30 days to walk away from the last place that still felt halfway solid. Behind him, the front door groaned open. Max came through first, the way he always did. The German shepherd was large, roughly 7 years old, with a muscular frame that mirrored Ryan's discipline in a way that felt almost eerie. His coat ran thick, deep black across the saddle, fading to warm tan along his legs and chest. Ears upright, alert even in perfect stillness. A faint scar marked his right shoulder, a trace from something Ryan never spoke about. His dark brown eyes held a steady intelligence that went beyond instinct, closer to comprehension. He wore a dark military-style collar. A worn metal tag clicked softly with each step. Max settled beside Ryan without being told, sat still, watched him. Not the house, not the street, him. Ryan let out a long breath. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, zero, underscore, underscore. Max tilted his head, as though the tone carried more weight than the words. The eviction wasn't the real problem, it never was. 2 weeks before, Ryan had lost his position at a small equipment repair shop on the edge of town. The owner had tried to soften it. Said things like, "You're a solid worker and it's just not the right fit at the moment." But Ryan had caught the hesitation behind the man's eyes. That same careful distance people always showed once they sensed something in him wasn't quite settled. He worked hard, picked things up fast. But there were moments, brief, sharp fractures in his focus, when something from before broke through. A loud sound, a tool clattering to concrete, a sudden movement nearby. Just enough to remind everyone that whatever followed him home from overseas hadn't stayed there. He'd stopped trying to explain it. Easier to walk away before the questions started, the ones he had no interest in answering. Across the narrow yard, a small figure lingered half-hidden behind a wooden fence. Liam Carter, 8 years old, thin in the way some children are when they seem to live more inside their own mind than in the world around them. Light brown hair fell unevenly across his forehead. Pale skin made his wide, watchful eyes even more striking. He rarely spoke. Most of the neighborhood had given up expecting him to. But he observed everything with a quiet focus that unsettled people. Everyone except Max. Max spotted him right away, rose to his feet and crossed the yard slowly. Liam stood frozen, silent, but his hand drifted upward, tentative at first, then steady as Max closed the distance. When the dog reached him, the boy pressed his small palm into the thick fur along Max's neck, fingers curling gently, like he needed something solid to hold on to. Max didn't shift. He lowered his head just enough to meet the boy's gaze. From the porch, Ryan watched. Something clenched behind his ribs, formless, unnamed. Liam's hand disappeared into the pocket of his oversized gray hoodie and came back holding a folded piece of paper. He hesitated. His eyes flicked toward Ryan, then down to Max, then forward again. He stepped closer and held it out with both hands. Ryan crossed the yard slowly, boots pressing into brittle grass, and took the paper. A drawing. Shaky lines filled in with what looked like worn-down crayons. A man standing beside a large dog, both of them facing open water beneath a wide, bright sky. The proportions were wrong, the details rough, but the intention behind every line was unmistakable. The man stood tall, solid. The dog pressed close against him, nearly touching, and the water ahead, calm, still. Ryan swallowed hard. "You drew this?" Liam nodded once. "For me?" One more small nod. Ryan stared down at the paper, his fingers tightening around its edges. He hadn't gone near water in years, not since before everything broke apart. Liam said quietly. Ryan went still. It was the first time he'd ever heard the boy's voice. Thin, barely sure of itself, but clear. Ryan held for a second, then nodded. Quote, _6 Max drifted back toward him, brushing against his leg, and Ryan laid his hand on the dog's head. His fingers sank into the familiar weight of that fur. For one brief moment, the noise, constant, low, restless, seemed to ease. But when his gaze returned to the house, the peeling paint, the hollow windows, the life about to slip away from him, the quiet didn't hold. Because as he turned toward the door to start packing, something felt wrong. The front door, he was sure he'd left it cracked, was shut tight, and Max, who had followed him through places far worse than this still street, stopped cold. Ears sharp, body locked, eyes fixed on the door as though whatever waited behind it did not belong. Ryan didn't reach for the handle. He stood motionless, his hand suspended inches from the knob, while Max held rigid beside him. Ears pitched forward, muscles drawn. A low tension coiling through his frame, the kind Ryan had learned never to dismiss. It wasn't fear. Max didn't do fear. It was precision, the kind that meant something had shifted. Ryan reached forward slowly and pushed the door open. Inside, everything sat exactly where he'd left it. Narrow living space, worn couch against the wall, small table with a chipped surface, a duffel bag half packed near the corner. Sunlight cut through the window, catching dust suspended in the air. Nothing moved, nothing missing, nothing that explained the door. Max entered first, nose low, scanning methodically across the floor. Ryan followed, breathing slow, controlled, the old training surfacing without invitation. Clear the room, check the angles, mark the exits. Less than a minute, no threat, no intrusion, just a house that had already stopped being his. Yeah, Ryan murmured. We're done here. He packed fast after that. There wasn't much. A few shirts, a worn jacket, a spare pair of boots, the drawing Liam had given him, folded with care and tucked into the inner pocket of his jacket. Max lay near the door as he worked, eyes tracking every movement like he was memorizing the sequence. By noon, Ryan stepped off the porch for the last time. He didn't look back. People who looked back stayed anchored to what was already gone. He'd learned that lesson the hard way. The truck caught on the second try, the old engine coughing before it settled into a rough, unsteady idle. Ryan gripped the wheel and stared down the empty street. Boise looked the way it always had, quiet, sunlit, almost gentle, but it felt like a place that had already released him. He drove without a destination at first, just away from the house, the job, the version of himself that had tried and failed to fold back into something ordinary. Max sat upright in the passenger seat, watching the road ahead. Every few moments his gaze shifted to Ryan, brief, deliberate, as if confirming he was still there. The repair shop crouched at the edge of town, low metal roof, equipment scattered across the lot like forgotten bones, rust eating at everything it touched. Ryan nearly drove past. Pride does that. Turns a simple left turn into a war. But the truck drifted in anyway. Gravel popping beneath the tires. Walter Hayes was already outside, standing at a workbench, sleeves pushed back, hands black with grease as though he'd been planted there since dawn. Late 60s, tall but stooped at the shoulders, the permanent bend of a man who'd spent 40 years hunched over engines. Hair thin and gray, beard uneven, shot through with white. His face carried lines that went deeper than years. Loss had moved into that face and never paid rent, never left. His eyes, though, sharp, missed nothing. But they held no verdict, just a quiet knowing. He looked up when Ryan stepped out. Quote 9. Quote. Ryan gave a half shrug. Walter dragged a rag across his knuckles, then tipped his chin toward the shop door. No sympathy in his voice, no pity, just fact. Ryan respected that more than anything anyone had offered him in months. Max dropped from the truck bed and moved close, positioning himself just ahead of Ryan's knee, claiming his place. Walter's gaze flicked to the dog, then back. Quote 12. Quote 13. Quote 14. Max's ears rotated at the sound of Walter's voice. But he stayed still. He didn't need to do more. Ryan knew what that stillness meant. The decision had already been made. Walter turned and walked inside without waiting. Ryan followed. The air hit him first. Oil and metal, dense and familiar. Tools hung along the walls in deliberate rows, each one resting in its exact position. Engines sat half open on the benches, wires exposed, components arranged with surgical care. Not chaos, a system. Something shifted in Ryan's chest. Not relief, not yet. Recognition. Walter picked up a wrench, set it back down almost without thinking. Ryan shook his head. Walter nodded, slow. He leaned back against the table, arms crossing. Ryan said nothing. He didn't need to. Walter kept going anyway. Army mechanic. Good with his hands. Better than me, probably. A pause. Just a beat. Didn't make it back. The words sat in the air, heavy, but not performed. Walter wasn't telling a story. He was reporting a fact, the way he might describe a cracked gasket or a seized piston. Something that happened. Something no wrench could undo. Ryan's jaw tightened. His eyes dropped to the table. I'm sorry. Walter waved the words away. Don't be. Doesn't change anything. Silence moved in between them. Not the awkward kind. The kind that didn't ask to be filled. After a moment, Walter straightened. Quote _23 quote. Ryan's gaze lifted slightly. Walter shrugged. He's always saying he needs more hands. Told him I might know someone. Ryan hesitated. Why? Walter looked at him directly. Because I know what it looks like when a man's got nothing left to lose. The words hit harder than Ryan was ready for. Walter reached into his pocket, pulled out a folded piece of paper and held it out. Address is on there. Name's Walker Hayes. Show up, tell him I sent you. That's all it takes. Ryan stared at the paper. Asheville. Not close. Not familiar. Not safe. But Boise wasn't any of those things anymore either. Max shifted beside him, pressing lightly against his leg. Ryan looked down at the dog, then back at the paper. Quote 28, he asked, quiet. Quote 29. The sentence dissolved into nothing. Ryan nodded, slow. He understood unfinished sentences better than complete ones. That evening, as the sun dropped low and golden light stretched across the empty street, Ryan sat behind the wheel again. The house behind him was no longer his. The shop was behind him now, too. In his hand, the folded paper carried more weight than paper should. Max jumped into the passenger seat on his own. Ryan turned the engine over, eyes locked on the road ahead. For the first time in longer than he could remember, his mind wasn't circling back. It was reaching forward. But as the truck pulled onto the highway and Boise shrank to nothing in the rearview mirror, a quieter thought settled in. What if this wasn't a second chance at all? What if it was something he was never meant to walk away from? The highway unrolled beneath a wide blue sky. Sunlight poured across the asphalt. Clean mountain air pushed through the open window. Pine, dust, and something that almost tasted like freedom. Ryan Miller drove without speaking. One hand firm on the wheel, the other loose near the gear shift. His posture held the stiffness of training, not ease. The truck shuddered now and then over rough patches. He didn't flinch. He rarely flinched at anything these days. His blue-gray eyes stayed forward, sweeping the horizon out of habit, even when there was nothing but empty land and open road for miles. Max sat tall in the passenger seat, still but watchful. His black and tan coat caught the light in warm streaks. Every few minutes, the German shepherd would turn his head toward Ryan. Not curious, measuring, reading something invisible. At 7 years old, Max had left impulse behind long ago. He moved with intention, with discipline that no longer required a command. There was a steadiness in that dog Ryan couldn't match. Not anymore. They had been driving nearly 6 hours when the first fracture came. A semi roared past in the opposite lane, horn shattering the quiet as it swung around a slower vehicle. The blast cut through the stillness like a blade. Ryan's knuckles went white on the wheel, his breath caught, his chest locked tight. His vision narrowed a half-second too long. The road smeared. The sound wasn't a horn anymore. It was something older, something buried deep. Max moved before Ryan could. The dog pressed his weight gently against Ryan's arm. Not forceful, not enough to compromise the wheel, just enough to hold him here. A low, steady sound rose from Max's throat. Not quite a growl, not quite a bark. Something between. A vibration that cut clean through the noise climbing inside Ryan's skull. Ryan blinked. Hard. Once. Twice. The highway reassembled itself. "I'm good," he said. His voice came out tighter than he wanted. Max stayed pressed against him, not yet ready to pull away. The silence rebuilt itself slowly, piece by careful piece, like something made of glass. Ryan exhaled through his nose, long, controlled. The way he'd been trained. Inhale, count, exhale, repeat. It worked. It always worked, eventually. But each time it left a residue behind. A quiet reminder that the war hadn't ended just because he'd walked away from it. They pulled off just before dusk at a roadside gas station somewhere between states. The kind of place that barely qualified as a stop. Low building, faded paint, a neon sign flickering and humming above the door. Inside, the air tasted like old coffee and motor oil. Behind the counter stood a woman, late 40s, maybe early 50s, tired eyes, sun-weathered skin. Her name tag read Doris. She was short, slightly heavy-set. Graying blonde hair gathered into a bun that had probably been tighter 12 hours ago. Her face carried the weight of years spent in routine. But something softened in her expression when her gaze landed on Max, 31. She said, leaning forward over the counter. Her voice was warm despite the exhaustion beneath it. Max held still, ears pitched forward, watching her with calm attention. No tension. Ryan set a bottle of water on the counter. Quote, 32, quote, he said. Nothing more. Doris offered a small smile. 33. Ryan didn't respond to that. He wasn't sure she was wrong. As he paid, her eyes stayed on him a beat longer than necessary. Not suspicious, just reading him. Ryan gave a single nod. She didn't push further. People like Doris knew when to stop asking. Outside, the sky had already started to shift, the blue deepening, going soft as the sun dropped lower. Ryan leaned into the truck's cool metal, letting it anchor him. Max pressed against his leg, that same wordless steadiness. Ryan pulled the folded drawing from his jacket, held it up in the dying light. The lines wobbled, the colors ran uneven. But something in the image held still, something he didn't possess. A man, a dog, water, stillness. You think that's real? He murmured. No answer expected. Max's ears flickered. Ryan exhaled, almost a laugh. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 39, underscore, underscore. But he didn't fold it away, not yet. They skipped the motel that night. Ryan couldn't stand in closed spaces outside his control. He pulled the truck into a quiet rest area just off the highway instead. The air had cooled, carrying insect hum and the far-off drone of passing cars. He tried to sleep. It didn't hold. The dream hit fast, no build-up, no warning. Blackness, noise, the sharp snap of something splitting air, a voice screaming words that refused to form meaning. They never formed meaning. Then pressure, heat, the crushing weight of something invisible. Ryan snapped awake, breath torn, heart hammering hard enough to ache. Max was already there. Paws braced against the seat edge, face close, eyes locked on Ryan's without blinking. No bark, no movement, just presence, solid, warm, real. Ryan leaned forward, pressing his forehead against Max's skull. His hands shook until he willed them still. "I'm here," he whispered. He wasn't sure who needed to hear it. The rest of the night came in pieces, sleep, then waking, silence, then memory. Each time, Max brought him back before the fall went too deep. By morning, the sky had cleared, sunlight breaking gold across the horizon. Ryan sat behind the wheel, staring forward. Exhaustion sat heavy in his bones, but beneath it, something else. Not strength, direction. He turned the engine over. As the truck found the highway again, Ryan didn't glance behind him, didn't check the mirror, didn't think about Boise. He thought about water. And for the first time, reaching it didn't feel like escape. It felt like something pulling him forward. By the time Ryan Miller reached Asheville, sunlight had mellowed into warm, late-afternoon gold, pouring across rolling hills and quiet riverbanks like something slower than the world he'd left. The town didn't rush him. That registered first. Cars moved, people walked, conversations floated through open air. But nothing demanded urgency. The atmosphere was clean, touched with water, wood, distant green. It didn't crowd him the way cities always did. It simply was. Ryan drove until pavement narrowed into something quieter, leading toward a small dock stretching over calm river. The water lay flat as glass, catching sky in long streaks of pale blue and gold. A few boats rocked gently at their moorings, old wood groaning softly with the current's rhythm. Max moved first. Before Ryan killed the engine, the German Shepherd was alert. Ears lifted, gaze fixed past the dock. No tension this time. No warning. Something else entirely. Recognition. Ryan stepped out slow, boots meeting wooden planks as he walked toward the water's edge. He hadn't stood this close to open water in years. It should have felt foreign. Instead, something shifted behind his ribs, a feeling he couldn't name, like a memory that belonged to someone else. That's a look I haven't seen in a while. The voice came from his left. Ryan turned. A woman stood beside a small food stand near the dock's edge. Clara Bennett looked to be in her early 50s, carrying a presence that felt steady rather than loud. Average height, build slightly full but strong, the kind of strength earned through years of standing, working, bearing more than she ever spoke about. Her hair was soft brown, threaded with silver, tied back loose at the nape of her neck. A few strands had slipped free, framing a face lined gently by time rather than hardship. Her skin carried a sun-deepened warmth from seasons spent under open sky. Her eyes, hazel, sharp, but not unkind, moved over Ryan with a quiet, measuring attention. A plain cotton shirt with the sleeves rolled back, a faded apron knotted at the waist, boots worn down past any memory of newness. Nothing fragile about her, nothing unsure. She looked like someone who had chosen to stay long after everyone else drove away. Max walked toward her without a single pause. Ryan caught it immediately. Max didn't do that, not with strangers, not without cause. Clara held still. She lowered one hand slow, unhurried, letting the dog decide on his own terms. Max closed the distance, sniffed once, and leaned gently into her open palm. "Well," she murmured, a quiet smile surfacing, "guess that settles it." Ryan came forward more carefully. "He doesn't do that with people he doesn't know." Clara gave a short nod. "Animals pick up on things we've trained ourselves to ignore." She straightened, wiping her palms against the apron. Ryan paused, then shook his head. "Haven't made up my mind yet." Clara watched him a beat longer, then tilted her chin toward the far end of the dock. "Then there's something you should see before you do." Ryan followed her gaze. Sitting apart from the other vessels at the dock's edge was a houseboat that looked abandoned by time itself. Roughly 30 feet stem to stern, a steel hull that had once been white, now scabbed with rust, the surface pitted and uneven. The wooden cabin above it had faded to a tired turquoise, paint curling away in long strips. Small windows clouded thick with age. The whole thing listed slightly to one side, sitting low in the water, as if it had been sinking for years but stubbornly refused to finish. Ryan moved closer, each step measured, deliberate. Max stayed at his flank, but quieter now, ears forward, watchful. Clara said from behind him. Ryan stopped. Clara nodded. Ryan's jaw set just slightly. "He came back changed," she went on. "Like most of them did. Didn't last in town long, bought that boat instead. Said living on water was simpler than living around people." Ryan didn't turn. His eyes stayed fixed on the vessel. Quote 53, quote 54. Ryan exhaled slowly. Clara moved up beside him, her voice dropping lower, a light shrug. Quiet filled the space between them, nothing but the soft tap of water against the hull. Ryan stepped aboard. The wood groaned under his weight. It held. He crouched, dragging his hand along the rusted metal edge. Bad. Genuinely bad. But not gone. He could see past the damage. Not what the boat was, but what it had once been. And what someone could make it again. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, quote, underscore, underscore, underscore. He asked, eyes still on the hull. Clara let the question sit for a moment. When she answered, her voice held a weight the price didn't explain. Dock fees went unpaid after he died. Nobody came to claim it. The owner planned to scrap it. Ryan straightened slowly. So? She held his eyes. $10 settles what's owed. Ryan stared. That's all? Clara gave him a quiet, knowing look. That's never all. Max pressed against his leg again, a warm nudge of weight. Ryan reached into his pocket. His fingers closed around the last of his cash. $10. The same amount that had set this whole road in motion. He paused, just a breath, then handed it over. Clara didn't count it, didn't need to. A single nod, as though something had just clicked into gear. Ryan turned back toward the boat, and something snagged his attention. Near the base of the cabin door, half buried under grime and peeling paint, was a small carved mark. Not random scratching, not wear. A symbol, deliberate and precise. Ryan stepped closer. His pulse slowed, then pulled tight. Because somehow, impossibly, he had seen that symbol before. Below, the river lay still that morning. Sunlight crept across the surface like something being uncovered rather than offered. Ryan Miller stood inside the houseboat's narrow cabin, sleeves pushed back, hands already streaked with rust and dust from a few hours of work. The air smelled of damp wood and age, heavy, stubborn, almost breathing on its own. Every surface told the story of years without care. None of it surprised him. He had walked through worse, far worse. What unsettled him wasn't the rot. It was the sense that something in this place had been left behind deliberately. Max circled the center of the cabin, claws tapping against worn wood. Something had changed in the German shepherd's bearing. Less at ease, more locked in. Ears pitched forward, nose pulling at the air in quick, purposeful draws. A tight loop, then another. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 64, underscore, underscore. Max halted beside the old built-in bench, dropped his head, one sniff, then a light scratch, just enough to say, here. Ryan moved in and crouched, dragging his fingertips across the warped planks. The wood gave differently in this spot, softer, slightly lifted against the surrounding floor. Not rot, not wear, a seam. He pressed down harder. Nothing shifted. Quote 65, quote, he muttered, rising. Quote 66, quote. The next hour unfolded in patient, grinding work. Ryan pried apart what he could without gutting the structure entirely. The boards fought him, swollen with years of trapped moisture, nails bitten deep by rust. He used a small pry bar from the toolbox near the dock. No rushing, no forcing. That was where mistakes lived. Max held close, tracking every motion. Then, a sharp crack. One board gave, another followed. Beneath them opened a narrow gap, dark and damp, just wide enough for Ryan to peer into the cavity below. The bilge. He leaned in, eyes narrowing against shadow. Water caught faint light from above, glinting at the bottom like something alive. But that wasn't what held him. Something sat down there, not drifting, set in place. Ryan pulled a flashlight from his bag and aimed the beam into the gap. Light broke through the dark and found the shape. A wooden chest, old, its surface dulled by time but unbroken. Metal corners reinforced each edge, tarnished yet still whole. Leather straps circled it, cracked but holding firm. A heavy padlock hung at the front, corroded solid. Max released a low sound, not alarm, not unease, something closer to knowing. Ryan's jaw set. Quote 67, quote, he said, barely above a breath. Quote 68, quote. Pulling it free was another matter. The space was cramped, the angle wrong. He lowered himself partway into the opening, boots braced against the edges, one arm reaching down while the other anchored his weight. The water was colder than he'd expected. It stung when it touched his hand. The chest weighed more than it should have. A grunt escaped him as he hauled upward, muscles pulling tight, gaining inches. Max shifted closer, repositioning himself as though ready to catch whatever might slip. Ryan dragged the chest onto the cabin floor. His breathing came harder now, sweat cutting lines through the dust on his skin. He sat there a moment, just looking at it. This didn't feel like finding something. It felt like disturbing something. Max settled beside him, perfectly still. Ryan's fingers found the metal lock. It held fast when he tested it. Frozen completely. Figures. He rose, stepped outside, retrieved a rusted hacksaw from his truck. When he returned, the cabin seemed to have drawn inward, the air thicker, the walls closer. The first stroke against the lock dragged slow, metal screaming against metal in a rough, jagged pitch. Took longer than it should have. His grip slipped once, twice. He adjusted and kept going. A dull snap. The lock broke free. Ryan went still, not from exhaustion. Max watched him, waiting. Ryan let a slow breath go, then pulled the straps away and lifted the lid. Inside, rows of small canvas bags filled the space, each tied with thin cord, arranged with care, almost with ritual. Every bag carried a tag, dates scratched in fading ink. Ryan lifted one, heavier than he'd guessed. He loosened the cord and opened it. Coins tumbled into his palm, silver, old, worn smooth, but their worth unmistakable. He opened a second, more coins. A third, folded bills this time, yellowed but preserved. Max leaned in, sniffed once, then drew back. Ryan's breathing settled into something slower. Not excitement, something deeper than that. Recognition. His hand reached further into the chest and found an envelope at the very bottom, sealed, brittle with age. The handwriting across the front was uneven but legible. To whoever finds this. Ryan leaned back against the wall, the envelope resting between his hands. He didn't open it. Not yet. He already understood. Not the specifics, but the weight behind them. He broke the seal with care, unfolding the paper inside. The words were plain. No flourish, no excess. A man named Thomas Hale, born 1947, United States Marines, Vietnam. He'd written about coming home to a world that no longer fit, about choosing the water for its silence, because it never demanded answers. He wrote about saving what he could year after year, not for his own sake, because he simply didn't know what else to do with whatever time remained. And at the bottom, one line cut deeper than the rest. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 71, underscore, underscore. Ryan lowered the letter, slow. The cabin went quiet around him. Max settled beside him, chin on his paws, dark eyes never leaving Ryan's face. Ryan stared at the chest, the bags. Years of another man's life stored piece by piece, laid out before him. This wasn't luck. It wasn't coincidence. It was something handed forward. And for the first time since leaving Boise, Ryan didn't feel like a man who'd wandered into something by accident. He felt like he'd arrived somewhere that had been holding its breath, waiting. But his gaze drifted back to the carved symbol near the door, the one he still couldn't explain. A thought rose, quiet and stubborn. What if this wasn't just something abandoned? What if it was something he'd been meant to find? Morning broke clean and bright over the river. By midday, the heat had burrowed into the metal hull like something alive, turning the houseboat's interior into a slow furnace of sweat and labor. Ryan Miller worked in shirt sleeves now. His military jacket lay somewhere forgotten. His forearms carried streaks of grease, rust, and thin cuts from edges he no longer bothered dodging. The boat had shown its true self over the past days. Weak points along the hull, seams that had given up years ago. Wood that looked solid until you touched it, then crumbled like wet paper. Not a single problem. A system of problems, each one feeding the next. And systems, he understood those. They could be repaired, or they could come apart entirely. Max paced the dock's edge in tight lines, never drifting far. The German Shepherd's energy had shifted again. Not the focused alertness from before, not the quiet steadiness either. Something sharper now, protective. His eyes tracked Ryan's every movement, as though sensing trouble before Ryan himself could. He was right. Ryan had been working near the lower hull seam, leaning out from the dock, pressing a temporary patch over rusted metal just above the waterline. The material wasn't ideal, he knew that, but it was what he had. Fingers steady, movements controlled. Then he heard it. A sound too faint for anyone else to register. A thin, wet crack. Ryan went still. Max's head snapped up. Water began pushing through the lower edge of the hull, slow at first, then gaining speed, forcing its way through a weakened seam Ryan hadn't reached yet. Seconds later, the seep became a steady stream. Damn it! Ryan dropped his tools and moved fast, stepping onto the boat, pulling up the floor panel he'd loosened the day before. The bilge was already filling, darker water rising inch by inch. He grabbed the manual pump from a storage compartment, old, stiff, barely functional, forced it into position, started pumping, muscles burning with each stroke. Max leaped onto the boat beside him, one bark, sharp, urgent, not at the water, toward the dock's edge. Ryan didn't look up, not yet. Max barked again, louder. Ryan turned. A support beam beneath the dock, hollowed out by rot, had shifted where he'd been standing minutes before. It gave way all at once, collapsing inward with a heavy crack. A jagged slab of wood swung down toward the boat's side. Max lunged without hesitation. The beam struck the hull's edge, scraping hard against metal before plunging into the water with a thick splash. But not before catching Max along the flank. The dog yelped, once, sharp, brief, then stumbled back across the deck. Ryan dropped everything. Max! He was there instantly, crouching low. The German shepherd stood but unevenly now, weight pulling off his front leg. A shallow gash ran along his shoulder, not deep, but enough to bleed. Ryan's jaw tightened. Quote, _72, __. Max held still. No whine, no flinch, just those steady eyes locked on Ryan, as though pain were something beneath his attention. The water churned louder below. Ryan glanced down. The bilge was rising faster now, and for one heartbeat, just one, the thought slid through him like a blade. Walk away. Leave it. Take whatever's left and start over somewhere new. He'd done it before, more than once. It would be simpler. Max shifted, pressing his weight closer despite the torn shoulder. Ryan exhaled hard through his nose, shook his head once, a sharp, physical rejection. No. He rose again, faster this time, something harder behind his movements. He grabbed a heavier patch plate from the dock, one he'd been saving, and drove it over the leaking seam. The fit wasn't clean, wasn't precise, but it held long enough for temporary bolts and sealant to lock it down. Then back to the pump. Push, pull. Push, pull. The rhythm turned mechanical, thoughtless, a thing his body did while his mind went somewhere else. His muscles screamed. Sweat fell from his jaw onto the wood beneath him. He didn't stop. Couldn't. Minutes bled together. Slowly, painfully slowly, the water quit climbing. Then, inch by inch, it dropped. Ryan kept pumping until his arms threatened to quit on him. Even then, he forced a few more strokes before collapsing backward. The boat settled. Not safe. Not yet. But stable. Ryan slumped against the cabin wall, chest heaving, eyes fixed on the floor like it might open up again at any moment. Max eased himself down beside him, breathing slower now, his injured shoulder resting carefully against the planks. Ryan reached over and pressed his palm to the dog's neck, felt the steady beat there. Quote, 73, he said quietly. Max didn't move. Ryan let out something between a breath and a laugh, though nothing about it carried humor. Yeah, I know. Later that evening, the sun hanging low and heavy, Clara appeared at the end of the dock. She carried a small container wrapped in cloth. She stopped when she saw the damage, eyes narrowing as they moved across the broken beam, the scattered tools, the damp boards. Looks like she tested you, she said simply, stepping closer. She handed him the container. Food, you'll need it. She crouched beside Max, hands gentle and sure as she examined the wound. He'll be fine, she said. Strong one. Ryan stared out over the water without speaking. Clara straightened, studying him now instead of the boat. You going to quit? Ryan didn't answer right away. The river drifted past, light bleeding into darker tones as evening settled over everything. He thought about Boise, the house, the job, the silence that had trailed him like a second shadow everywhere he went. Then he looked down at Max, at the boat, at his own hands. He said finally, it wasn't loud, but it was the first decision he'd made in a long time that didn't taste like running. Morning light draped itself across the river, turning the surface into pale gold and soft blue, the kind of quiet beauty that never demanded anything, just earned it slowly if you stayed long enough. Ryan Miller stood on the deck of the houseboat, one hand resting on the freshly sanded railing, his posture no longer rigid from habit, steady now, by choice. Months had passed since the night the boat nearly went under, and the difference wasn't something you saw, you felt it. The hull, once corroded, fragile, wore a deep, dark blue finish now. Smooth, deliberate, catching sunlight and quiet reflections. The cabin, rebuilt plank by plank, no longer carried the smell of damp rot. Clean wood, warm air. The windows had been widened, letting light flood the interior instead of leaking through in thin shadows. It wasn't a different boat, same vessel, just given another chance to become what it was always supposed to be. Ryan understood that better than most. He looked down at his hands. The scars hadn't gone anywhere. Small cuts and calluses layered over older marks from a different life. But they didn't feel like reminders anymore. They felt like evidence, proof that something had continued instead of ending. Behind him, Max crossed the deck slowly, favoring his front leg just slightly. The wound from months ago had long